Why does America have so many denominations? It's not just the historic main lines, there's also a bunch of offshoots, a bunch of other things, and a vast ocean of non-denominational churches. You know, historically most countries had one church, but a bunch of countries colonized America at the same time. So originally the different American denominations were just extensions of various European state churches. But the First Great Awakening broke down denominational boundaries, and for the first time in history, people had absolute freedom to choose between a menu of different denominations. In fact, almost every aspect of American religion, such as celebrity pastors, a necessary born-again experience, and leaving your church if you don't like the pastor, started with the First Great Awakening. So let's see how that happened. But first, only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed, so if you want to see more, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind. If you liked the video, make sure to click the like button, and if you didn't, make sure to click the dislike button twice. The New World's been discovered and everyone wants a slice of it. England makes a colony and the established church there is the Church of England. The Dutch make a colony and the established church there is the Dutch Calvinist Church. The Church of England's currently Episcopalian, meaning it's run by a hierarchy of bishops, but there are some Puritan Calvinists within the Church of England who are Congregationalist, meaning they want all churches to be equal. And some Congregationalists give up trying to purify the Church of England and separate, so they become the separatists. But the Church of England is the only acceptable denomination, and they get persecuted for not being in it. So they sail away on the Mayflower, start the Plymouth Colony, and invent Thanksgiving. But the Puritans are still there, and the king doesn't like them. Hey yo, Puritans, let's make a deal. I want more colonies, you want Calvinism, I want you gone. So if you start your own colony, you can run the church there however you want, and hopefully nobody will cut off my head. Works for us. So the non-separatist Puritans start Massachusetts, and the established church there is Congregationalist. It's still technically part of the Church of England, but all pastors and churches are equal, and it's strictly Calvinist. That's good enough for the Plymouth separatists, so they unseparate and join Massachusetts. Massachusetts becomes a Puritan utopia. Everyone's a devout Christian, everyone can read, everyone works hard, so nobody lives a lavish lifestyle, but nobody's poor. They started Harvard to train ministers in Puritan theology. The top theologian was John Cotton, and he was more Calvinist than Calvin. Calvin believed in predestination, but said you shouldn't try and figure out if you're predestined. Whereas John Cotton said you're gonna know if you're predestined because you're gonna have this powerful conversion experience. He said that because he wanted every Puritan church to be made purely of elect members in covenant with each other, so they had to be able to show that they're actually elect. Wait, said Thomas Hooker, if somebody doesn't feel like they've been converted, what can they do about it? Nothing. It's a spontaneous free gift of God. But that wasn't good enough for Thomas Hooker. He said if somebody wasn't converted, they could do good works to prepare for God to convert them. But John Cotton thought this was basically works-based salvation with extra steps. All the churches agree with Cotton, and Hooker can't exactly start his own independent church, because it's considered sinful, schismatic, and illegal to start a church outside the established denomination. But remember, the king said anyone who starts their own colony can run the church how they want, so Hooker starts Connecticut and then all the churches there teach preparationism. Then when Harvard goes liberal, the Connecticut Puritans start Yale to teach their beliefs. Anne Hutchinson reacts against Hooker's preparationism and says works are not evidence of salvation, but she claims to be able to see who is elect, so she gets kicked out of Massachusetts. Roger Williams is a Puritan minister who adopts Baptist theology and tries to get his congregation to separate from the denomination, but that's illegal, so he gets kicked out of Massachusetts. He starts the Rhode Island colony and starts a Baptist church there, but then he separates from it because it's not good enough. So then Anne Hutchinson moves in, and Baptists become the de facto established church in Rhode Island. Then the Rhode Island Baptists start Brown University to teach their beliefs. Then the New Hampshire Puritans start Dartmouth to train Native Americans in Puritan theology. Sweden makes a colony where the established church is Lutheran. Then the Dutch Calvinists conquer it, but the people are still Lutheran. Then England makes more southern colonies where the established church is Anglican. Then English Catholics make a colony, but it becomes Anglican. Then England conquers New Netherland, but the people stay Dutch Reformed and Lutheran. Pennsylvania gets started by Quakers who believe in religious liberty, and Presbyterians need some of that because they're persecuted in Scotland during the killing times. So they move to Ireland and then to Pennsylvania, so they get called Scots-Irish. Then an Irish Presbyterian named Francis Makemie moved to Pennsylvania and converted a bunch of Quakers by explaining why we need the sacraments for salvation, and he started the PCUSA in Philadelphia. The New England Puritans are doing very well. So well, in fact, people are starting to take things for granted. You see, the first generation of Puritans knew what it was like to be persecuted in England, so they were very zealous. But the next generations got more comfortable and lazy, and church membership started to decline. This is because you couldn't be a church member unless you were personally converted, and more people were unconverted. They tried to solve this with a compromise where the infant children of unconverted people could be halfway members of the church through a halfway covenant, meaning they could be baptized but not vote or take communion. But many saw this as a sign that the church was getting secularized and diluted. Another way the Puritans suffered from success is that Harvard became such an elite school, it attracted many academics from Europe who were influenced by Enlightenment ideas like deism, rationalism, and Unitarianism, which denies the Trinity, and this began to influence the people. Now, to be clear, things were not that bad. Compared to today's denominations and societies, they were very devout and morally strict. But they failed to live up to the astronomically high standards set by their forefathers, so many people got nostalgic and wanted to return to that. Keep that in mind for later. A new religious trend going on in Europe was Pietism, where people got sick of nerdy scholasticism. Scholasticism is when theologians would use abstract philosophy to try and answer every possible question by making a million distinctions. But this made the faith too intellectual for some and distracted from a personal relationship with Jesus. In other words, St. John says to love one another. So we need to distinguish between the material and formal cause of love, as there are 8 senses in which an ordered relationship can be accidentally but not essentially one of mutual— Shut up, nerd! The Pietists want to focus more on heart knowledge than head knowledge. They want a faith that ordinary people can actually live out in the real world, so they invent the concept of a Bible study. Lutheran Pietism spread to England and influenced these 2 young Anglicans named John and Charles Wesley. They were students at Oxford and started a club for other students who wanted to be serious about living out their faith in the real world. They had a method that led to righteousness, which is why they were called Methodists. John Wesley was very influenced by Moravians, those Protestants who were Protestant before it was cool. Charles Wesley translated a lot of their hymns, and all the Methodists were influenced by their focus on community. But the Methodists were still not a separate denomination. They were all Anglicans within the Church of England. The Methodists dedicated every hour of their day to spreading God's kingdom. They fasted, they set aside time to pray, they taught orphans to read, they fed the poor, they did Bible studies, and they evangelized everywhere they went. They were kind of like Protestant monastics, except they lived in the real world, led normal lives, and had families, rather than living separately from the world on a mountain somewhere. They also cared more about mission than theology. For example, one of the members of their group, George Whitefield, was Calvinist, and Wesley was Arminian, but that didn't stop them from working together. Remember how New England's going downhill? More and more Christians are now nominal and not personally converted. Jonathan Edwards wants to fix this and go back to a time where basically everyone was serious about their faith. So he gives some fiery sermons in a surprisingly calm and academic tone of voice. Okay, thank you all for coming. Let's see here. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you, and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. It would be dreadful to suffer the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God one moment, but you must suffer it to all eternity. There will be no end to this exquisite horrible misery. When you look forward, you shall see a long forever, a boundless duration before you, which will swallow up your thoughts and amaze your soul, and you will absolutely despair of ever having any deliverance. Can you all please quiet down? I'm trying to finish a sermon here. Anyway, where were we? Surprisingly, though, this worked. More and more people got converted, so they invited more people who got converted, and they invited more people. The town was aglow with the energy of revival. And then it wore off, just like that. But then George Whitefield arrived, and he believed he could recreate the revival with emotional preaching and banging on the pulpit. You gotta cry and shout with joy and emotion, or you're not saved. Whitefield's revivals were spinning out of control. People weeping and moving around was seen as evidence of a true conversion experience, so Edwards distanced himself from these revivals. The revivals became unpopular in New England because most people already went to church, so Whitefield began moving to the middle and southern colonies. And he found fertile soil for revival there. Pietism had already spread to the middle colonies through a Dutch Reformed preacher in New Jersey called Frelinghuysen, and he had a reputation for being a very emotional preacher and policing the lives of his congregation to extreme degrees. Hendrik, what'd you do yesterday? Horse racing? That's sinful. No communion for you. Burger's Dick, what did you do yesterday? I read a book. Other than the Bible? You're not saved. No communion for you. Van Diaper, what did you do yesterday? I worked on my 119-volume systematic treatise on theological institutes. That's all head knowledge. You don't have heart knowledge. No communion for you. Frelinghuysen also made friends with a Presbyterian named Gilbert Tennent, who was very into revivals and didn't care much about traditional church structure or formal education. Most Presbyterian ministers had to be educated at Harvard or Yale, but his dad started the Log College to train ministers in experimental revival tactics. You guys are in the Log College? It's not even a real school, bro. You gotta go to Harvard or Yale. Well, actually, the Log College eventually evolved into Princeton. But either way, Tennent and Frelinghuysen had a lot in common. They were both very emotional preachers. They both focused a lot on a personal conversion experience, and they both had an utter disregard for traditional church structure. How? Well, they both got in trouble for preaching together despite being in different denominations. What's wrong with that? Most modern Americans don't see what's wrong with that because they've been influenced by the First Great Awakening. But the problem wasn't theology, because Presbyterians and Dutch Reformed have always had identical Calvinist theology. The problem was jurisdiction. At that time, different denominations were expected to stay in their respective jurisdictions and not step on each other's toes. So when Whitefield made it to the Middle Colonies, he started working with them as well and fanned the flames of their revivals. Whitefield got in trouble for being a traveling preacher. What's wrong with that? Once again, the issue was jurisdiction, a concept that has been lost in modern Protestantism. Land was divided into parishes, each that had a church, and everyone in the same parish would attend the same church. So back then, asking someone what church they went to was a really stupid question. Each parish had a minister who had jurisdiction over that parish, but had no jurisdiction in a different parish. So when George Whitefield showed up and began preaching from place to place to place, all the parish ministers got really mad at him because he was stealing their sheep and usurping their authority. People would come to hear Whitefield preach rather than their own pastors. He was the first celebrity pastor because that was unusual back then, even though it's very common now. These days, people take the opinions of celebrity pastors online more seriously than their own pastors, and people even listen to Christian YouTubers who are not pastors more than their own pastors. So, as a side note, guys, please stop asking me advice for personal questions that you should really be asking your local pastor about. Then Whitefield spread the revival to the southern colonies and Methoded all over the place. Methodism was still technically part of Anglicanism, but the Anglican leaders didn't really like it. With these four preaching everywhere, the First Great Awakening was now in full swing, with revivals happening all over the colonies. This was the first time the colonies were ever spiritually united, and it was the first time ministers of different denominations did ministry together. They were called the New Lights because they had completely new ways of doing ministry, but they would soon come into conflict with the Old Lights, who thought their revivals were superficial, emotionalistic, disorderly, and interfered with the established church structure. In fact, all four of their denominations were about to divide, either officially or unofficially, between the New Light and Old Light parties within them. While the Methodists were technically New Light Anglicans, most of the Anglicans, especially the clergy, were Old Light and did not like the revivals. But luckily, this didn't actually cause a split in the Anglican Church. Yet. The Dutch Reformed Church became divided between the Doggers, who supported Frelinghuysen, and the Cloggers, who did not. This almost caused a split in the church, but it didn't, because some of the Cloggers went, "Hey, you know how Frelinghuysen's all emotional and stuff? We heard it's because he's gay." And then several of the Cloggers got excommunicated. The split was a lot uglier for the Presbyterians. Most Presbyterians were Old Light, meaning they didn't like the Awakening, but there was a growing number of New Light revivalists, such as Tennant, within the Presbyterian Church. Their biggest disagreement was standards for ordaining pastors. Old Lights wanted to make sure all pastors conformed to the Westminster Confession and had good academic credentials, whereas New Lights really just cared that all pastors were personally born again. The Old Lights criticized that as the Donatist heresy. During this time, Presbytery meetings generally went like this. "Alright guys, we have to ordain a new pastor. Let's look at our candidates." "I can recite the whole Westminster Larger Catechism backwards in my sleep." "Sounds good to me, let's ordain him." "Wait, how do you know you're truly born again?" "I just told you." "We can't ordain him, he clearly isn't born again." "I don't know much about no Westminster whatchamacallit, but I believe the whole Bible, and you can tell I'm born again because of how loudly and passionately I preach about it." "You're perfect." "Wait, this guy's completely unqualified to preach." Gilbert Tennant went a step too far when he wrote a sermon called The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry, in which he said to leave your church if you think your pastor isn't truly born again, even if he has the right theology and good morals. These days, church hopping is very common, but back then, to suggest that someone should leave their church based on a bad pastor was shocking and scandalous. He also said that the Old Light pastors were unsaved for not supporting the revivals. So, in response to the danger of an unconverted ministry, the Old Lights wrote a sermon called The Danger of an Unqualified Ministry. For this, Tennant was kicked out of the Presbyterian Church. The existing Presbyterian Church was the Synod of Philadelphia, or the Old Side, but Tennant started the Synod of New York, or the New Side. Now, the New Side started off smaller, but they grew rapidly because they didn't care about jurisdiction, and because they didn't respect the jurisdiction of the other colonial churches. But after 17 years, Tennant repented, and the two sides reunited into the Synod of New York and Philadelphia. The established congregational churches in New England were strictly Old Light because they didn't like traveling preachers stealing their members. But a bunch of separate New Light congregational churches began to form that didn't care about jurisdiction at all, and George Whitefield supported them. But unfortunately for him, they all soon became Baptist. Whitefield didn't approve of this, but he should have seen it coming. Many Old Lights, like Charles Chauncey, overreacted against the revivals and embraced a cold, hard rationalism that eventually would lead them to Unitarianism. At this point, the Great Awakening is basically over, and people aren't really any more religious than before it started. So it failed its original goal of making the colonies more Christian. All it did was break down the traditional church structures. But it did have one major side effect. You see, all these denominations moving around into each other's neighborhoods created a united spiritual identity in America for the first time. So when the American Revolution started, there was already a sense of unity among the colonies that wouldn't have existed without the Great Awakening. During this time, a Presbyterian pastor, John Witherspoon, who was president of Princeton, formerly the Log College, was seen as America's pastor, and he was the only pastor to sign the Declaration of Independence. Now, at this point, Anglicans and Methodists are still both part of the Church of England, but they have a major problem. You see, the Anglicans in the colonies didn't have their own bishop who could ordain priests for them, because England was worried that would make them feel too independent. Instead, all the Anglicans in the colonies were under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of London, so if they wanted new priests, the Bishop of London had to ordain them and ship them over to America. But when the Revolution started, England cut off their supply of priests to punish them. Now, Anglican ecclesiology states that there should be one national church per country, so with the American Revolution, the Anglicans in the colonies knew it was time for an independent Church of America. But how could they make one without any bishops in America? How are they going to solve this? Now, thanks to the Awakening, Anglicans were theologically divided into spontaneous New Light pragmatists and by-the-book Old Light idealists. So the New Light Methodists like John Wesley were thinking, we have a priest shortage now. There are souls that need to be fed now. Let's address this problem and worry about the ecclesiology of all of it later. Now, Wesley was a priest or presbyter, not a bishop, but despite this, he ordained 2 bishops. As an Anglican, he believed a succession of bishops was ideal, but not absolutely necessary. But the Old Light Anglicans didn't think that was valid at all. So when the Methodist bishops started the American version of the Church of England, many Anglican priests didn't join it and wanted to create a more legitimate Episcopal church with an unbroken succession of bishops. Samuel Seabury wanted to become a bishop so he could start this church, but that was a bit tricky because none of the English bishops would ordain him. Now, even though the established Church of Scotland was Presbyterian, there was a small schismatic group of Scottish Episcopalians left over from the Jacobite rebellions, so Seabury got ordained by them. But when he got back, many Anglicans still didn't think his ordination was valid because the bishops that ordained him were schismatic. Even though they were Episcopalian, they understood Presbyterians had jurisdiction in Scotland, not Episcopalians. Come on, even I think schismatics had valid ordination, but they didn't. So the Episcopal Church couldn't get started until other bishops got ordained by legitimate English bishops. Once America gained independence, many people wanted there to be an established Church of America. But who was that going to be? There were already 7 historic Protestant denominations that were established in different parts of America. At first, some people proposed a kind of co-established church where all 7 of them would work together. But that got complicated real fast because each of them was worried that the others would basically take over. So instead, Witherspoon proposed that the de facto Church of America would be an unofficial alliance between these 7 Protestant denominations, where each of them would have jurisdiction all over the newly formed country. He did believe in separation of church and state, but this is largely misunderstood. It doesn't mean the separation of Christianity and state. Witherspoon still believed it was the state's job to promote Protestantism and make laws that supported these denominations, but it wasn't supposed to favor any one of them in particular. In other words, religious liberty back then meant, which of these 7 Protestant denominations do you want to join? This de facto Protestant Alliance Church of America is what we today call mainline Protestantism.